I'm Dr. Rahul Kumar Moore, Assistant Professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion, Banaras Hindu University. So I extend a very warm welcome on the behalf of Department of Philosophy and Chookolingo lecture series. Today we have Professor Francis Xavier Clooney with us, who is a great scholar of comparative religions and theology. And Professor Clooney will be speaking on the recent developments in comparative religious and theological studies. So a very warm welcome to you, sir. Now, to begin with the program today, I would like to request all the dignitaries on the dais to please join us for the floral tribute and prajaling the deep. So after this auspicious ritual of Deep Prajalan and floral tribute on the bust of Malviji, this is the time for offering Mangalacharan. Now I would like to request the research student Prabhat Ranjan Tiwari for reciting the Mangalacharan. Yeah.
शान्तं शाश्वतमप्रमेयमनघम् निर्वाणशान्तिप्रदम् ब्रह्मा शम्भुफणीन्द्रसेव्यमनीषम् वेदान्तवेद्यं विभुम् रामाख्यं जगदीश्वरं सुरगुरुं मायापतितमोक्षितं मनुष्यं हरिं वन्देऽहं करुणाकरं रघुवरं भूपालचूडामणिं वागार्थाविव सम्पृक्तौ वागार्थप्रतिपत्तये जगतः पितरौ वन्दे पार्वती परमेश्वरौ.
Thank you, Prabhat, for beautiful recitation of Mangalacharan. Now I would request the Buddhist research scholar present over here for the Buddhist Mangalacharan. Please join us.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Jayanto Bodhiya Mule Sakayanan Devatano Evan Tawang Vichayo Vichaya Suchaya Mangale Aparajita Palanke Se Padavi Puakare Abhiseke Sapabhutanang Akapato Pamotati Sunakatan Sumangkalan Supapatan Suotitan Sumuto Jasuyetam Brahmachari Supadakinang Kaya Kamang Wajak Patakinam Manokamam Panitete Patakina Nikatawana Rabantate Patakine Bhavatu Sapamang Karang Rakantu Sapate Vata Sapakut Nupavena Sata Sote Pavantu Te Bhavatu Sapamang Karang Rakantu Sapate Vata Sapadamma Nupavena Sata Sote Pavantu Te Bhavatu Sapamang Karang Rakantu Sapate Vata Sapasangkanu Pavena Sata Sote Pavantu Te.
Thank you all for really beautiful recitation of Mangalacharan. Now I would request the students from music department, Sneha and Kazol, for a recitation of Kulgeet.
मधुर मनोहर अतीव सुंदर ये सर्ववेद्या की राजधानी मधुर मनोहर अतीव सुंदर ये सर्ववेद्या की राजधानी ये तीनों लोग से न्यारे काशी सुज्ञान धर्म सत्य बसे है गंगा के रम्य तट पर, ये सर्व विद्या की राजधानी, राजधानी। नए नहीं है ये ईट पत्थर, है विश्वकर्मा का कार्य सुंदर, रचे है वेदा के भव्य मंदिर, ये सर्वश्रेष्ठी की राजधानी, राजधानी। यहाँ की है पवित्र शिक्षा के सत्य बिके हरिश्चंद्र थे यहीं पर, ये सत्य शिक्षा की राजधानी, राजधानी। बवेद ईश्वर की सत्यवाणी, बने जिन्हें पढ़ के ब्रह्म ज्ञानी, थे व्यास जी ने रचे यहीं पर, ये ब्रह्म विद्या की राजधानी, राजधानी। वो मुक्ति पद को दिलाने वाले, सुधर्म पथ पर चलने वाले, यही फले फूले बुद्ध शंकर, ये राज ऋषियों की राजधानी, राजधानी। सुरम्य धाराए वरुणासी, नहाए जिनमें कबीर तुलसी, भला हो करता का क्यों ना कर, ये वाद विद्या की राजधानी, राजधानी। विविध कला शास्त्र गायन, गणित खनिज औषधि, प्रतीचि प्राची का मेल सुंदर, ये विश्वविद्या की राजधानी, राजधानी। ये मालवीय जिन देश भक्ति, ये उनका संदेश, ये उनके शक्ति, ये मालवीय जिनकी देश भक्ति, ये उनका साहस, ये उनके शक्ति, प्रकट हुए हैं नवीन होकर, ये कर्म वीरों की राजधानी, राजधानी। मधुर मनोहर अतीब सुंदर, ये सर्व विद्या की राजधानी, राजधानी। मधुर मनोहर अतीब सुंदर, ये सर्व विद्या की राजधानी, राजधानी।
Thank you very much, Sneha and Kajol. Now I would request our head of the department, Professor Anand Miss, to kindly felicitate our speaker with shawl and garland. I would request Professor I would request Professor Jha to please present a memento to our speaker of the day. Now, I would request our head, Professor Anand Miss, to also felicitate chair of this session, Professor R.K. Jha. Now I would request our head, Professor Anand Mishra, to make a formal welcome address. Sir.
Hari Om. Honorable Speaker, Professor Francis Clooney, Professor R.K. Jha, chairing the lecture, convener Dr. Rahul Moria, students, friends, and scholars, offline or online. I, on behalf of the Department of Philosophy and Religion, welcome you all in this Chookolingo lecture series of the department. Friends, this is the first lecture of Chookolingo lecture series of the session 23-24. We are really fortunate that Professor Clooney is the speaker on the occasion. We are really fortunate. In fact, as all you know, that Professor Clooney is founder of Comparative Theology. I can say father of Comparative Theology. So we are really fortunate that he is with us and would deliver on recent development in comparative theological and religious studies. Professor Clooney is expert of Christianity, Hinduism, a leading scholar of religious studies. And apart from that, he is a renowned scholar of, we can say, of Sri Vaishnava school. In fact, I can say he is Ubhay Vedanti. Why? Because he is equally commanding over Sanskrit as well as Tamil sources of the system. That's why he, in fact, belongs to that tradition of acharyas who were Ubhay Vedantins. So such a great scholar is here in this department. We are really very thankful to Jan that we could have his lecture. I welcome Professor Clooney once again, Dr. Jan. I also welcome Professor R.K. Jha. In fact, he is chairing the lecture and it is his own department. I welcome other scholars who are present here. Prabhupada Mukhopadhyay from Sanskrit department, Dr. Priyanka from Political Science department, Dr. Priyanka Misra from our own department, Dr. Shruti ji, Kalpana ji, Rahul ji, Rajiv Vehra, another is R.K. Singh, K.K. Misra, Alok Tandon ji, who is connected online, number of scholars who are connected online. I welcome all of you. I hope you would enjoy the lecture of Professor Clooney. Once again, I welcome you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Though Professor Francis Xavier Clooney doesn't require any introduction, he is well known in the area of comparative theology, and is also authority in Christianity and Hinduism, and yet has a requirement of formal introduction. Let me read his brief bio, though his CV goes unending. Now, Professor Francis Xavier Clooney is an American Jesuit priest and scholar in the teachings of Hinduism. He is currently a professor at Harvard Divinity School in Cambridge. Professor Clooney is a native Brooklyn, New York. He graduated from the prestigious Regis High School in Manhattan and entered the Novitiate of Society of Jesus in 1968 and was subsequently ordained in 1978. Following that, he earned his bachelor degree at Fordham University in the Bronx, New York. After earning his doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations at the University of Chicago in 1984, Clooney taught at Boston College until 2005, serving also as the academic director of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, a recognized independent center of the University of Oxford. When he became the Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard Divinity School. In 2010, he became the director of Harvard Center for the Study of World Religions. That same year, he was named a Fellow of the British Academy. His primary areas of scholarship are theological commentarial writings in Sanskrit and Tamil tradition of Hindu India, and the developing field of comparative theology, a discipline distinguished by the attentiveness to the dynamics of theological learning, deepened and enriched through the study of traditions other than one's own. He has also written on the Jesuit missionary tradition, particularly in India, and the dynamics of dialogue in the contemporary world. Professor Clooney is on a number of editorial boards. He was the first president of the International Society for Hindu Christian Studies, and from 1998 to 2004, he was also coordinator for interreligious dialogue for the Jesuits of the United States. Professor Clooney has authored several articles and books and served as the editor of the OCHS Hindu Studies book series for Routledge. His current project include a study of yoga and Jesuit spirituality. In 2010, he was the recipient of Henry Louis III Fellow in Theology, awarded by the Association of Theological Schools. In 2017, he was nominated as the winner of the John Courtney Murray Award for his distinguished theological achievement. So I welcome you, sir. Now may I request you to please deliver your lecture. Thank you.
So, good afternoon. I would like to begin by thanking Dr. Jha, Professor Moria, Professor Mishra, and all of you for the kind welcome bringing me here today. This is such a venerable institution. Benares Hindu University is so well known in the West. I see all the prestigious images on the back wall, only some of the great figures connected. Some of the presidents of the department chairs and so on are well-known scholars. And it's very great honor for me to give this Chookolingo lecture series, in the lecture series, this presentation today. I can also add that in 1977 or so, I wrote to the university inquiring about the possibility of doing my own doctoral studies here. I wrote asking whether you would accept a foreign scholar and whether I could come for my PhD study. And immediately they wrote back and said, yes, you could come for the PhD in Sanskrit or philosophy, but you have to do the BA degree first. And in those days, that was the requirement, the BA before the doctoral degree. And I felt that I couldn't afford to take the time that that would require. So instead, I went to the University of Chicago and did my studies there in the South Asia department. And otherwise, but it certainly was in my mind, even almost 50 years ago, that this would be a wonderful place to study. So as I give my presentation today on the theme, Current Developments in Comparative Religious and Theological Studies, I'm aware, even from introductions before when we were sitting in Dr. Mishra's office, of the many fields that are taken up by people in this room, in Jainism, in Shaivism, in Vaishnavism, in various darshanas of Indian philosophy, the studies of Western figures such as Rawls or Heidegger, other wonderful scholars, East and West, and aware that I can add little to some of the areas of expertise that you have. So what I would like to do in my presentation is, as I say, current developments in the field of religious and theological studies in order to set up kind of a framework in which we can have a discussion. I always feel that one part of my work is to give a presentation, but the reward that I receive is the question and answer period. And that even yesterday when I spoke on the Alvars of South India, I learned so much from the Q&A. And I will look forward to hearing from you, your questions, your areas of expertise as I proceed. So what I would like to do in my presentation is simply go through the images that I have, the slides that I have on the screen here. Is that big enough for you to read? Okay. It's an eye test. If you have eye chart problems, you can move to the front. But basically, to go through I think about 12 slides altogether in order to set forth a framework for my discussion. And if anyone would like this PDF, I can send it to you, or Dr. Mishra can give it to you. It's certainly simply meant to be a help and nothing unique in itself. So I thought it would be good to begin with a sense of what I call the old stories. The way in which in the West, and I cannot speak entirely for the developments here at BHU in the 19th and 20th century, or 21st century, but certainly aware in the West of the changing relationship between theology and philosophy. And I sketch it in very general terms. You may think of many details that, of course, I'm leaving out. And in the medieval period in the West, there was a certain dominance of the Christian church. This is not surprising. It was very much a Christian culture. There was some knowledge of the Arabs, Greek philosophy mediated through the Arab thinkers. There were great Jewish thinkers, such as Maimonides, writing, and the Christian theologians were aware of them. But there was certainly a dominance of the Christian West. And the thinking of the Christian West was taken as normative for all that counted as theology and philosophy. The study of religion really meant the study of the religion. And the religion, of course, was the Christian religion. And in the way that theology was explained by figures such as Saint Bonaventure, whose feast day in the Catholic Church is today, a great medieval philosopher theologian, but most importantly, Thomas Aquinas, who was perhaps the greatest of the Catholic thinkers in the Middle Ages, that philosophy is the supreme science. and that you have physics, you have cosmology, you have anthropology. Is it echoing somehow? So, okay. So you have different fields of scientific knowledge, but above them all, and the final one is theology, because all knowledge culminates in knowledge given in theology, partly based in revelation. And it was an unquestioned principle that above philosophy came theology as the final full science. So this perspective, we could talk about this later. I don't mean to say that is the perspective now, it's not. But in the Middle Ages in the West, it was taken that you go through the natural sciences, the human sciences, philosophy, and finally there is theology and revelation. Now this was the model that broke down at the time, as I say, of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, more or less, and then the Great Enlightenment, the recovery of reason, the argument for free thinking, and basically pushing away the authority of clerical figures, clergy, priests, bishops, and so on, in order to have free thinking. The Protestant Reformation, which divided Christianity and pushed back against the idea that the Catholic Church was normative, pushed away at the idea that there could be a single ultimate theological discipline, and that there were always going to be different perspectives, because every thinker, including for someone like Martin Luther, every individual person, every individual believer would go back to the scripture and word of God themselves and speak from there authoritatively. So this was a change in dynamic, going from a kind of divine science that descended down to earth to a human science where even knowledge of God, knowledge of the church, knowledge of Jesus Christ rose from the people. And this was a change in attitude. And then in the Enlightenment period, and many of you have studied this very deeply, I'm sure, figures such as René Descartes, Voltaire, Immanuel Kant, in different ways, figures like Leibniz or Spinoza, Hegel, and others, argued basically that beyond theology, there needed to be a philosophical science that was greater than theology. And that theology was trapped in the clerical framework. It was trapped in the hierarchy of the church, and that what we needed was to trust human reason, human freedom, in a way that could not be controlled by any clerical authority anymore. I'm sure there are analogies in the Indian context about what counts as free thinking, liberated reasoning, and reasoning that is somehow subordinate to Shruti or Sampradaya, whatever, and arguments about secularism and religion, which of course come to the fore. But as this changed in the 19th century and so on, it accumulated, the effects of the Protestant Reformation and then of the Enlightenment really overthrew the idea that theology was the highest form of learning. And there had to be a study of religion, a philosophy of religion, a history of religion that was more reliable, more dominant, more fully to be explained and trusted than anything that could come from a theological perspective. As I say there, number 4, religious studies was valued as a breakaway from theological knowledge. So by the end of the 19th century, with comparative religion as a field, even beginning earlier with people like Max Muller at Oxford University, but a host of other figures, saying that what we need is to understand religion as a phenomenon, and that the idea that there is a Christian dominant structure is no longer to be taken for granted. So I'm sure you have in your library the Sacred Books of the East, and this 50-volume magnificent collection, most of which is slightly out of date translation-wise by now. Max Muller wanted to say that for European intellectuals, we need to make available the knowledge of other traditions in other parts of the world. And while it's an incomplete series, 50 volumes, there's so many things that are not covered. The idea was that a new science, not theological science, but rather religion science, philosophical religious science would come to the fore and take the lead. And there was then thereafter, which I think in some ways continues even to today, a tension between, as I say there, faith-grounded and secular study of religion and related issues. Even in the 21st century, at some universities in the West, particularly if they have a religious affiliation, there is a sense that there has to be some deference to revelation, some deference to the Word of God. But increasingly, particularly in secular universities, or even in universities that used to be religiously affiliated, the idea that there cannot be any such hold, and that while theology and philosophy seem to be in tension, philosophy is winning the battle. And non-affiliated, objective knowledge about religions in the plural should take precedence in any university setting over any partisan perspective from a particular tradition. And I think here we can see, as I mentioned Max Muller already, comparative religion becomes a scientific field that in essence replaces theology as a supreme kind of science. The older notion of comparison, which you see in the missionary era, when Western missionaries went to China, Japan, came here to India, in the Islamic world, in the Americas, comparative work in these volumes that came out in the 19th century, like the 10 Religions of the World, or Everything You Need to Know About the Religions, always ended by showing that Christianity was the supreme religion, and that what was good in the other religions would be subsumed and taken to its fullness in the Christian religion. By the end of the 19th century, and increasingly in the 20th century, this fell into disrepute. The charge was meant that these authors are not really unbiased, but they're doing all this learning in order to show the truth of what they already believed before they started. So how can there be a comparative study of religion that does not depend on believing that one religion is greater than the rest of the religions? So comparison as an explanatory principle, simply we learn by comparison, and we learn by comparison without objective conclusions about which is better than the other. So all of this was developing, and on this first page you can see I have so much breadth of knowledge, discovering so many things. If you have questions about particulars, keep them in mind, because we can push and take this apart. But I go on from there to say changes in the past 25 years, which is easy to say and hard actually to do. I mean, I do not have an encyclopedic mind, and although I'm at Harvard University, I don't speak with authority for the entire study of religion. But these are impressions that I have after teaching at a university for about 40 years. So my own impressions after much time, that what is speeding up and happening, let's say from the middle of the 20th century, maybe the 70s and so on, is, as I say, diversification and secularization of the culture in which religion is studied. And I'm thinking not so much of India, because you can bring this into the discussion, but the Western civilizations such as United States, the UK, France, and Germany, and so on, were no longer what we called in the old days Christendom, Christian cultures with a set dominant thing that we all believe in the following way, but rather an increasingly diversified culture in which no particular theology or religious position or even philosophical perspective would be accepted as the best or normative. Individuals are always writing books in which they describe the ultimate philosophy that explains everything, or the philosophy that is the most rational, the most explanatory. But it's almost impossible by the time one gets to the end of the 20th century to take seriously anybody's effort to say it's bedrock fact. I mean, there might be more of the spirit in the air of showing why and how it is really not possible to come up with some bedrock position. One of my favorite thinkers, although I'm not sure I really understand him, is Ludwig Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein, if you ever try reading his philosophical investigations, you often get confused, because so much of the time he's giving examples and asking questions, and trying to say all those philosophical questions you have are really not questions or philosophical problems at all if you get rid of them, if you pay attention to what you're actually talking about. So everything begins to come apart, and the critique of the Christian religion, the critique of Christian theology is spreading out to say any kind of normative position is no longer going to be possible. And this is, again, a cultural thing before we get to the universities, an American pluralism of religions, growing diversity. And this is taken for granted in India. I'm not saying anything that you would not know for, I don't know, we're in Kashi thousands of years, that there are many different religious traditions. But I think it's been dawning on Americans increasingly in the last 30, 40 years, whether they like it or not, that other religions other than the Christian are here to stay. They're in the United States, they're growing, they're not going away. Symbolically, we have Hindus now, Muslims in the Senate or the House of Representatives. Our Vice President, Kamala Harris, has a Hindu and African American heritage. The Prime Minister of the UK, of course, is a Hindu. The consciousness of the West is changing, that pluralism is part of our culture and part of who we are. But then it speeds up even further. People might say, okay, now we have 7 religions, 10 religions, 12 religions. Then suddenly younger people are saying, but I really don't want to be a member of a religion per se, because I believe myself to be spiritual and not religious. And perhaps this is a theme here as well. We're belonging to a set religion with a set authority structure, a set theology, a set philosophy is not going to work anymore. And therefore the idea of dissolving kind of a normative Christian perspective turns into kind of a philosophical perspective that's normative, but that too begins to dissolve, not only on university campuses, but also in popular culture. And so that when people talk about religion today, there's a great sensitivity, particularly to younger people, but not only, who say, well, you're speaking as if we all have to have a religion. We don't. I can shop around, I can try this, I can try that, I can go to church and practice yoga, I can do Zen and go to synagogue, I can pray as a Hindu, I can pray as a Catholic. All these things are shifting around. That has to change how we think about philosophy, religion, theology, and so on. And my point is that a lot of it comes from outside the university, pushing into the campus, that we're no longer in a place where the academics can make things very neat anymore. I just already spoke about the greater awareness of the multiplicity of religions, and added to that, increasing decline of the authority structures that used to hold things together. And again, it would be similar, but I think different here. But if we think back to when I was a child, a while back, many of the Christian churches, the Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church, Lutheran Church, Baptist Church, had enormous authority. And the presidents of the United States and so on would always defer. You see a picture of John F. Kennedy with a cardinal, or you see Dwight Eisenhower or Jimmy Carter with a religious leader, enhancing his authority by being with a religious figure. Now many of the politicians are no longer believers in specific religions, and also think it's a mixed bag. It may not actually help at all to be seen with religious leaders, because the religions are losing membership and also credibility. So there's been many scandals in the American churches, many shocking or embarrassing, inappropriate activities and so on that have come forward. And so no longer is there anyone to look to in the culture and say, that man, usually a man, speaks for all of us religiously, or that man tells us what the morality of the country should be. The culture is in a great flux. And I'd be interested when we talk about whether you see the same here, or has that been true for a very long time in India, or is there a similar kind of secularization, questioning of authority, young people choosing their own path? Is it something like the West, or is it actually different? We can talk about that. So changes of the past 25 years in the culture in general, and then following from that, changes in As I say, the study of religion is changing, religions in the plural is changing. And again, this is sort of academics, professors catching up with what's going on. I don't think the leaders of thinking differently about religion are the professors or scholars, but the professors are catching up with what other people are thinking because they want to be listened to, they want to sell their books, and we try to do our best. So religious studies today, there is a special place for historical studies, textual studies, or philological studies that in some sense changes as history changes, but you still have very precise studies of a time period, of a particular thinker, that strive for a certain objectivity. It's not about ideology, it's not about faith, but historical studies that try to take any period of theology or philosophy or religion and put it in a historical perspective, which often defuses it and says this is not eternal, but it's a product of its times. Or on the other side, textual studies. Here, to be a Sanskrit scholar, Panini's grammar doesn't change that much, right? Even if you have sectarian grammars as well, there are certain grammatical rules. There are certain ways in which philology is done. You either know the language or you don't. And being subjective about Sanskrit without being able to read Sanskrit, it does you no good. So too with Latin or German or Russian or Hebrew. The philological stays. So those, I put that in simply because not everything is subjective. But I think there's a sense that of the study of religion in the humanities is undergoing great change in the current day. And that how we think about what it means to study religion is growing more and more diverse. First of all, it is taken for granted nowadays that you can't study or have a department dedicated to just one religion or two. In the old days, it would be the Christian religion, obviously, but then beyond that, Jewish and Christian. Now there's a great push to say, well, Jewish and Christian and Muslim and Hindu and Buddhist and Jain, Sikh, also the religions of East Asia. And then what about indigenous native traditions of Africa and the Americas, and so on and so on. The idea that no one can control which religions get to be studied and which religions get to be ignored. And this is spreading out as a phenomenon that I think is changing how we speak and think, because if you go back 150 years or 100 years ago, you might think that a professor could be the expert on religions today. And I think by now, anyone who knows what they're talking about says, no professor can be the expert on all the things we need to know. So there's kind of a deflation of the authority of the professor figures. And I mentioned there the great diversity of religions at the American Academy of Religion, which is the largest body in the world for the study of religions. We have an annual convention usually in November, and we get anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 scholars showing up to do all aspects of religion. And I just want to read to you a little bit from the program book for this coming convention in San Antonio, Texas in November. I'll just give you a few titles as a sample of the sessions. So it used to be Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on. But here, for example, Anglican Studies Seminar, Animals and Religion Unit, Anthropology of Religion, Applied Religious Studies Committee, Artificial Intelligence and Religion Exploratory Session, Arts, Literature, and Religion Session. Let me skip to another page. Indigenous Religious Traditions, having a joint session with Native Traditions of the Americas and Religion, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies. Lesbian Feminisms and Religion, meeting with the Mysticism Group. Law, Religion, and Culture Unit. Political Theology Unit and Queer Studies in Religion. Disability Studies, meeting with Popular Culture Section. I could go on for 10 minutes. The program is online, but you can see probably about 200 sessions, none of which are sort of Hinduism and Christianity or simply philosophy of religion, but every kind of smaller interaction between different kinds of theories and understandings. In some ways, it's brilliant and exciting. So you go to the convention, as I do every year, and suddenly you're among 5,000 to 10,000 professors, which can be a frightening possibility. You see all these professors with white or gray beards and so on like that, and women of various ages, of course, as well. And you realize that this is like the Tower of Babel in the Bible. Everybody's speaking a different language, and there's no normative frame anymore. Preference for lived religion, popular religion. Sometimes I'm skeptical because it seems that those who speak about their preferences for lived religion or popular culture is that they either don't want to or cannot actually read the great text anymore. But I think seriously, some are saying, why read the elite textual materials of any tradition when you should go out of your study, out to the streets? Don't study this or that, darshana or Christian philosophy. Go down to the guts and talk to people and see what they think religion is. And sort of from below, religion arises. And that's a wonderful reality and wonderful thing to do, but it's infinite and endless, and every person you talk to can have a different viewpoint. And I think it would be very hard to say everything that everyone says is normative. And so there's a great confusion on the ground, but the point is it's showing up in the academy now too, where going to lived religion, popular religion is changing things also. And I add there, which is very essential, and I only mention it briefly and we can talk about this, awareness of the political and the demand for justice. And the sense that I think, particularly for younger scholars today, there is a great suspicion of the study of religion that is not tuned to issues of justice, issues of oppression, the elites versus the ordinary people, the power structures that make certain ideas more popular, other ideas silenced or excluded, the voices that are never heard in the academy. Who gets to decide the sacred books of the East? Who gets to decide what's in the 50 volumes? A suspicion that not only is it limited, but also you would be suspect of any professor who claimed that they could do a normative set on anything. So the theme of, as I say here, liberation as a theme, that the point, and this is a very hyper-suspicious view, as a scholar, my duty, many are saying, is to uncover the hidden motives, the self-serving possibilities of academic structures. And that even great universities like Harvard University, University of Notre Dame, Stanford University, and others are suspect because the faculty are the people who have all the privileges. So what's going on, and analogously in other cultures as well. So I'm pointing out trends, and I think I'll stop very soon and we'll talk about this. In this context, comparative study changes. And this perhaps is really getting to the heart of what I wanted to mention. If the way we think about religion, theology, what is true, religion in the singular, religion in the plural is changing, then obviously comparative religion is changing too. That what do you compare? I think we can agree that there is an inevitability to comparison. We compare all the time. We're always making comparisons. I'm standing here talking. You can compare me with some other professor who stood here last week. Next week, you can compare some other professor to me. We compare all the time. And I think part of the idea is that comparison is inevitable everywhere, but we can sort out different kinds of comparison that serve different purposes. So not simply comparative religion, but as I say, scientific comparisons, historical comparisons, philosophical comparisons. You could add literary comparisons, poetic comparisons, comparisons based on the arts, comparisons based in music, and on and on. That comparison is no longer a simple thing. And when you say, I am a professor of comparative religion, people will immediately say, well, what do you actually do? What do you compare? And if you say, I compare Buddhism and Hinduism, they'll walk away. They want to know much more narrowly, and then which genre, which field, which subspecialty you are working in. And I think it's still a category whether comparison is theological or not. And what I mean by this is that many people who think about comparative work are thinking in terms of just creating new knowledge. We learn by comparing. We learn by this idea from ancient India or 20th century India, 21st century India, and this in the medieval or modern West, this in the Veda, Quran, this is in the Bible, this is in some other scripture. We learn by this process, but are you learning as a believer or without any reference to your belief system? We could ask, we don't have to get personal about it, but in the room here, whether you think of yourself or any of us think of ourselves as believers within a tradition, and does that affect the way we do philosophical work or work at the university? I mean, it's certainly a custom and a tradition to say, I'll leave my personal faith out of it. And you can read books by great scholars when you don't know what they personally believe. Somebody like me, I have an SJ, Jesuit Society of Jesus, after my name. I always make it clear that even if I'm reading something in Purva Mimamsa, Advaita Vedanta, Sri Vaishnava commentary, I'm starting out as an American Catholic from New York who's a priest who practices Christian faith. Not to say that is super number one, but rather I don't want to hide from you the fact that my biases will be there. And somebody else can have other biases religiously, or if somebody says, I'm entirely secular, I believe nothing, that too is a bias. So where are we coming from, theologically, non-theologically, and we can talk about this. And great cautions arise regarding comparative studies in the era of post-colonialism. Again, concern for minority voices, who's doing the comparison, what texts or themes or thinkers are being compared, who's being left out, hyper suspicion about elitism in classics. There was an interesting discussion you may have read a couple of years ago at the classics department at Princeton University, where a tenured professor in the department writes to the fact that he thinks the department, he's African American, that it's a horribly racist classics department. And that while he wasn't about to give up his tenure and walk away, he said we have to radically transform what we think about classics, whose classics, when classics, which classics, if this field is to have any credibility. And again, when we talk about the classics, when I was a child, we meant Greek and Latin. We meant Homer, Aristophanes, the playwrights of Greece. We meant Virgil, we meant Cicero, and on and on. Now, when we say classics, which culture, which language, all of that has changed. There is even a further critique, first of all, that to use words like Hinduism or Christianity or Buddhism is misleading because it sounds like Christianity refers to that, Hinduism refers to that, Buddhism refers to that, when there's really no that there. Every word you use actually is hyper complicated. And to talk about, I will now do a comparison of Hinduism and Christianity on the following theme, is misleading because you're not really going to do that. Unless you're depending entirely on something less sophisticated than Wikipedia, some textbook that simply says, this is Hinduism, this is Christianity, now compare them. You are going to make thousands of choices, and that to pretend there's one Sanatana Dharma or one true Christian faith that is normative is no longer acceptable. I'm describing this, I'm not defending it 100%, but that the impossibility of doing comparisons based on the fact of stable, different religions is no longer going to work. So we go on from there and begin to think, well then, if that's the case, then what are we talking about when we talk about religion? What exactly is religion as a category? In the singular or in the plural? On a popular level, so many people say, my faith is not a religion, but a way of life. But also at the American Academy of Religion, so many professors are talking about we have to get rid of the category of religion. And we have to think in a different way about what we study, cultural studies, literary studies, political studies, subaltern studies, and so on. So instead of the American Academy of Religion, you'd have the American Academy of blank, because you can't use the word religion anymore. And it goes too far at times, but the critique is there. Again, the motives that people have in their scholarship, why are they writing that book? What are they getting out of it? Who benefits from it? And I think it's a real question, not that it's going to suddenly happen, but will there be a recognizable entity called religious studies 20, 25, 30 years from now? Or will it be so different that people who, let's say, practice study of religion in 1950, 1970, 2000, in the year 2050, I'm not sure I'll be here, but you'll be here, will say, well, that's not what we meant by religion. That's not the way we meant the study of religion. The whole field may dissolve as well. So to move on quickly toward my last points, I think, as I said at the beginning, there was an era in the Middle Ages in the West where theology was the #1 discipline. And it was the queen of the sciences, the highest level of knowledge. And then philosophy, mathematics, the sciences, and so on were lower than theology. And over the past hundreds of years, with the Reformation, the Enlightenment, post-colonialism, gender studies, gay studies, and so on, the whole enterprise has crumbled. But I think because of the diversification to the extreme in the study of religion, religions beyond religion, that there's still a place for theology. And I realize that this may be a little bit controversial because over the past 50 years coming and going from India and South Asia, I've learned that often theology is seen as very partisan and narrow, and philosophy is the greater term. But in my tradition, the Catholic tradition, theology can be richly philosophical, richly rational, and there may be a chance for it to come back. So theology, faith-seeking understanding. You or we have some belief system, and we're asking questions about what does it actually mean, and we're pushing ahead on it. Philosophy and theology are both intellectual disciplines. Neither one need to be banished for the sake of the other. Today, we can say that neither one controls the other. You can't philosophize faith or theology out of existence. You can't theologize philosophy into a lower position, but they both exist. What does it mean in a pluralistic world when there are not one religion but many religions, when in every room, including this one, there are believers in different traditions? What does it mean to say we practice faith-seeking understanding, faiths in the plural, understandings in the plural, different ways of seeking? It's very complicated, but I think there has to be room for this kind of focused, faith-based thinking to make a comeback. And while it can be say, well, that's what you do in church or temple or synagogue, I would say in the highest academic circles, you can also make the claim that thinking with faith, thinking from faith, can have a better role because the world has changed so much. Faith theology can come back. We need to be able to re-engage the ancient tradition. Sorry, I'm losing control here. So Christian theology renewed, doing theology in a new way. But I would say, and I'll be interested in what you think, Jewish theology, Muslim theology, Hindu theology, Buddhist theology, are these realities? And there are books in the West now of Buddhist theology, Hindu theology. Is that a contradiction in terms that we say, well, we don't use the word theology, so please don't? Or faith-seeking understanding is no longer something Christians do, but people of any background and practice can begin to use terms like theology, just as everybody uses terms like philosophy. Beyond comparative religion, comparative theology, which is my field, as the professor said in introducing me, that comparative theology is to be very comparative, very interreligious, no longer working within one tradition, but still some kind of a sense that I, who believe something somewhere in one tradition, am seriously learning from a tradition that I did not grow up with. not simply, I mean, certainly it involved like going to sacred places, participating in sacred rituals, listening to the recitation, and so on, but also reading the sacred texts, reading the philosophies. I think this is possible, and this back and forth, faith-seeking understanding across religious boundaries is really what I mean by comparative theology. Since I'm a major proponent of it today, I would think that theology that is not comparative theology is going to keep going downhill. Every theologian, every faithful thinker has to be able to cross religious boundaries and understand and deal with pluralism. Otherwise, I'm sorry, I only believe in my religion. I only think as a Catholic or a Vaishnava or a Taoist. I think that will not really work in the contemporary world. I mentioned 2 books here, and again, if you want my notes, you can ask me for them. Catherine Cornell, professor at Boston College, Meaning and Method in Comparative Theology, and on a more general level, Oliver Freiberger, Considering Comparison, a Method for Religious Studies, the way that comparison has thought about it. When I was preparing this presentation months ago, Professor Mishra suggested that I have the covers of my books available. And so I put them on the screen here. I'm just going to show them to you because they're actually rather pretty, seeing them together. But I'll point out just several of them. I'm not going to go through them all, but just to show you some of my very pretty covers. All these books can be bought if you want to go on Amazon or some secondhand bookseller and buy them. Thinking Ritually, Purva Mimamsa was my first book. Theology After Vedanta, 1993, was taking Shankara Vedanta and making some comparisons with Thomas Aquinas. So 30 years ago, I was already trying to do this comparative learning. Seeing Through Texts was my first effort to work on the Divya Prabandham, the Sri Vaishnava works of the Alvars, and the Bhagavad Vishayam set of commentaries on them, drawing that into comparison with some themes in Christian mysticism and the like. I'll keep going. 2 books that go together, Hindu God, Christian God, How Reason Helps Break Down the Boundaries Between Religions, thinking about God interreligiously, focusing on Hindu and Christian, arguing that anyone, namely Christian theologians who want to think about God today, should be thinking interreligiously. And there's nothing to be gained by being a Christian theologian who only knows Christian theology. So I'm pushing that theme. And then because I didn't deal with it in that book, I wrote this other book called Divine Mother, Blessed Mother, Hindu Goddesses and the Virgin Mary, which annoyed both some conservative Catholics and some very conservative Hindus who thought you shouldn't put Mary and the goddesses together. It's somehow a disservice. But what I was trying to do is say that we in the Christian tradition don't have a divine feminine. Some people talk about the Holy Spirit as a kind of Shakti. But nonetheless, by thinking and learning from Hindu goddess texts, and I use the Sri Guna Ratna Kosha, Parashara Bhattar, Soundarya Lahari, attributed to Shankaracharya, and then a Tamil text, the Abhirami Andadi. 3 beautiful goddess texts, putting them in conversation with Christian texts about the Virgin Mary, and trying to work out a comparative thinking about the feminine. So that's just another example. I will keep going here. I think I can skip those for now. And then more recently, I did this book on the left side, Comparative Theology, Deep Learning Across Religious Borders, a book that kind of explains what I mean by this field. His hiding place is darkness. Some of you may know, the mystical poetry of Kabir, Mirabai, the Tamil saints, putting that kind of poetry in conversation with the Song of Songs in the Bible. And the mystical love of God, what is that about? How do we deal with the mystical when we're sitting in an academic setting in a university? So I'll stop there with my books. Again, if you want to learn more about them, you can find them. This is the most recent one, Reading the Hindu and Christian Classics. I gave Professor Mishra a copy. If you're nice to him, he'll let you look at it. But basically trying even now to do work and say, we have to be able to study and read and do comparative work. So I say all that in light of after the breakdown of Christian dominance, after the Enlightenment, after the rise of the study of religion, after the fall of the study of religion, after post-colonialism, after hyper-skepticism, after all of these things, that I think optimistically there's a kind of way in which faith can come back into academic study. And I don't know if you believe that or not, but I think that's what's happening, if not in all universities in the West, but in some of them. And I wonder if that makes any sense to you here. So to conclude, this is indeed my last image. What comes next? Again, I'm too old to really worry about what comes next because I'll be gone, but you will be. You should worry about what comes next. When you finish your studies, if you're a student, where will things be 20 years from now? The study of religion will continue to diversify, but possibly disappear into cultural and political studies. Everything is political. Everything is cultural. Everything is a matter of language. And oh, by the way, let's not use the word religion anymore. So it may just flatten out. What happens to philosophy? I think similar questions could be raised. Theology will decline in universities as it is. Fewer theology departments, fewer openings teaching theology. But theology, I've made clear, I don't think will go away. It will continue off campus. And there have to be places where intellectuals who have faith can practice both faith and thinking. Not faith without thinking, but faith with thinking, I think should be part of the future. Theology should flourish in a comparative form, but the future of the study of religion, theology, comparative studies, and this I close with, I think a lot of it will happen outside the West. So like here and everywhere else in the world, that the West needn't be the leader anymore in the study of religions or theology. It needn't be done in English, although I'm grateful when you do it in English so I can read it more easily. But nonetheless, it can be done elsewhere in other ways, not in terms of the history of the Christian Middle Ages, the Christian Reformation, the Christian Enlightenment, but the history, your history, here. How do we change how we think about these things? In South Asia, I actually meant South Asia, not South India, and in all the intellectual settings that are represented in this classroom. So I've covered a lot of material, and hopefully not in too superficial a sense, but basically to set up a framework where we can, in our remaining time, talk about study of religion and all the related issues. So I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Clooney, for really interesting and engrossing discussion that you provoked. Originally, I had the same question, that what actually you do when you're doing comparative religious study. And I think your entire lecture has unfolded a kind of complex character of this idea of comparative religious study is. And you began with the medieval period in the West when Christianity was so powerful, and then especially the philosophical culture which began subjecting to the religion's rational scrutiny, beginning with Descartes and Spinoza, Leibniz and Kant. Gradually, a kind of religious, the normative framework got diluted into various kinds of different religious identities, or the kind of plurality of religious frameworks. And with this religious plurality, right, whether we can, that will there be any particular religion, or we are moving towards gradually non-religious or secularized fashion, right? And on the other question where you talked about this comparative religious study, and you rightly pointed out that it is really becoming difficult to have any comparative study, because it always requires a fixed framework of a particular religion. And that is becoming difficult. Why? Because there could be a diverse understanding of religions available in the popular cultures, or available among the intellectuals, or different sort of communities, how these people are understanding religion, or even subjecting it to a different time frame. And then if religion is actually diluted and diffused into diverse uh, normative frameworks, and then it would be really difficult to have any possible comparative study. And even if it is possible, suppose if I'm allowing to have a religious comparative study in a particular time framework, or referring to a particular intellectual culture, and then point is whether this comparative study with one particular time framework or a particular intellectual culture is, I mean, I'm just missing the point that I just wanted to say. Whether this the plurality of the religious understanding can also lead towards a more secularized a culture of university, or as society at large. Because if there is no possibility of one religious framework, if the religion is diffused into a various diversity, and then we cannot have any one fixed identity of religion. And moreover, when you were talking about that today people are actually practicing different kinds of religious cultures, and yet being born into one religion, it seems that people are not very much religious in their everyday life, because they are into a crisscross of different religious practices. And then what remains for the person to be religious is, I think, it's only a kind of political identity, where certain political people can always mobilize peoples for a certain political identities. Otherwise, in our everyday life, we are not religious at all. Or if you are practicing a diverse religious frameworks, and I think that is also diluting a particular religion as such. So, and I think these questions you have already hinted at. So with this, I would invite the audience to ask your questions to the speaker. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, sir, for your wonderful lecture. My question is in connection with the comparative religion. Comparative religion. A lot of interreligious dialogues are going on for centuries, and usually what they do is to discuss on some similar thoughts, similar insights from different scriptures. But it is very rarely found they are working on the dangerous part of the scriptures. Scriptures have contributed a lot to the world spiritually, but at the same time, we have to understand the fact there are a lot of ideas which are very dangerous, which insist violence, which insist disharmony, and so on. But none of the religions wants to change even one word from the scripture. How can interreligious dialogue is possible or harmony is possible when the scripture itself is against harmony? So I think even the scriptures have to be revised according to the needs of the time. If you the scriptures are timeless or scriptures are unchanging, it's very dangerous to the humanity. So my question is, can the revision of scriptures be a new trend in the inter-religious dialogue?
So thank you for that first question. As I said in my introduction, this is the really interesting part for me because I hear so many interesting questions that are raised. I would think the starting point would be, yes, that I think dialogue at the beginning often is on the common ground or the parts of our scriptures that we are most proud of, that we like to put forward. But if it's an honest intellectual discussion going forward, we have to, as you say, deal with the difficult parts and the parts that are embarrassing and problematic. And I would say that on the one hand, I don't think it helps to say we should rewrite the scriptures or cut out parts, even though in practice we do, certain parts we never talk about. But I think at another level, rather to say, on the one hand, how have people in the traditions dealt with these difficult parts over thousands of years? So I know there are difficult parts in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, that theologians in those traditions have dealt with for a long time. To talk about the difficulties and then a knowledgeable person in the tradition saying, I'm a rabbi. I'm dealing with this difficult passage in the prophets. And here's how we have dealt with this. And then listening to somebody say, well, this is in Bhagavad Gita, this passage in the Ramayana is difficult, for example, whatever. This is the way commentators and scholastic thinkers have thought about it for a long time. And then begin to have the further conversation that I think is needed about not only the easy parts, but the difficult conversations. So both about the scriptures and dangerous ideas that come from the scriptures about the exclusion of the other, the domination of the other, the declaration that the other is completely false. So I think partly another way to put what I'm saying is a compliment. This kind of new dialogue that I think you're pointing to would actually be more interesting than many dialogues, because it would be getting at the tough issues, but would also require of individuals more preparation. So, I won't give examples, but to really think on that level. But again, if I understood you properly, actually revising the scriptures and cutting parts out, I can't imagine doing that with the scriptures I know of. But nonetheless, what are the scriptures we never ever talk about? What are the passages in any scripture that we always gloss over to get to the good quotes? So I think there's a lot going on there that I think could be a much more interesting kind of comparative religious theological conversation. Thank you. Do people just come up with? Okay. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Oh, okay. Would it help if I give them the mic and I stand at the?
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Clooney, for your very insightful, descriptive lecture. I had the honor of attending your lecture yesterday on the Alavas, and it's a related question about the violence of the scriptures. For a political scientist like me who's interested in politics of religion, and the most recent project that I'm doing is on gendered intellectual history of modern India, trying to trace these political values and concepts from a feminist gendered lens and invoking the list of thinkers who've not got the attention. And one theme that constantly emerges in reading, from Therigatha, which is an ancient text, to the medieval times, and then you come to the contemporary times and you read a satirical text like Tarabai Shinde's Stri Purush Tulna, or high caste Hindu woman of Pandita Ramabai Saraswati, or much later in 20th century Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay's rendering of socialist rendering of the feminine concern, and the violence of religion meted out on the lives of women, the double standards that religion coming from canonical sources, scriptures, how do we engage with that? Because when you look at the scriptures, obviously there are these double standards that not just emerges for the women, but also for those who are marginalized. So saying that, and also the possibility of opening the canons, the religious canons. Now, you mentioned very brilliantly that, there is a need to look for other sources. The possibility of looking at writings or the hymns of somebody called Akka Mahadevi and creating an alternative canon, because that's a more egalitarian way of living, or a more egalitarian normative. So when we talk about opening the canon, the possibility of looking at the margins, looking at the folk narratives, looking at the everydayness, because religion, if it is about providing certain normative values, it's the same, I mean, it's a similar job which is being undertaken in these sources. And the second thing about invocation of religion. Now, religion per se and invocation of religion, two different things, because invocation of religion is a deeply political pursuit. And what you see in modern India, right from the times of the critique against colonialism, religion was invoked in a certain manner. Right now we are celebrating the centenary celebrations of Gita Press, and Gita Press, is being celebrated for creating creating a sense of the nationalist self. Now, if you look at Gita, the invocation of religion in the text that the Gita Press has postulated for over the last 100 years, how do we make sense of something like this when we talk about the invocation of religion? Thank you. Too many things. And also, I would like to congratulate the department for organizing this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, also for coming today after yesterday. I think much can be said, again, because you're dealing, as I was saying, I think, the instinct today that nothing in the study of religion, and of course in the study of philosophy, is non-political. And justice issues always come to the fore, or should come to the fore, because we don't do anything well by being naive. What? No. We don't do anything well by being naive about these matters. I think what on the one hand, therefore, we want to uncover the difficult parts of our traditions, not simply in basic scriptures, only the classical text, but also in the great philosophers and thinkers. I mean, sometimes we say, the scripture is great, and then this pundit, this scholar, this bishop, and so on, are beyond question. And to be able respectfully to raise hard questions, even about the thinkers in the tradition, or the names on, the pictures on the wall, and so on. All of that, I think, has to go on. But I don't think it should begin by my saying, let's have a dialogue, and now I'm going to pin you down on what's annoying in your scripture. So I found this passage in your scripture that is really hateful toward women, and I want to push you on that, saying, see what's wrong with your religion, because missionaries did that kind of thing quite often. Hopefully, the first stage would be to see how people have dealt with the hateful and the violent in their own tradition. I mean, many years ago, there was a book by a woman called Phyllis Tribble about tales of terror and the violence toward women in the Hebrew Bible. And I think that could be a starting point for a conversation. She deliberately went through the Bible, picking out the passages that seem to do most harm to women, and then said, I, as a thinker responsible to this tradition, want to struggle with it and deal with, how do we deal with these problems without throwing the Bible out the window? And how do we deal with the Quran or the Veda without throwing them out the window? But hopefully saying, are there intellectuals in the traditions who are doing the hard work? Not starting on the outside. The other thing I'd say, because there's so many things you raised, would be about expanding the canon. And I think, as you say, Akadevi or something like that would be quite brilliant to include in the canon, and not simply what you find in some online source or something. But I found also the concern that expanding the canon can lead to the possibility that there's really no canon there anymore. The nice thing about the canon, like the canon of the Greek and Latin classics, we're all reading Homer, we're all reading Plato, we're all reading Cicero, and so on. And that this entire kind of intellectual system of Oxford and Cambridge and so on premised, we have the great texts, now let's argue about them. But once you open the door to the great books of the East, and then to say more, push it further, de-sanctify the canons that we have, is it possible to hold anyone responsible? So you could say, well, all right, that person is in your canon. I don't care about that. So I'll turn over and say, let me talk about some other thing. Do we end up with, again, the problem raised at Princeton, or the debate about classics in the US? Does the word classic even mean anything anymore? For instance, here at BHU, in philosophy and religious studies, is there kind of a set of normative texts that everybody in the room agrees we have to be able to read? It's very hard if you look at the American Academy of Religion to say, and the people, the thousands of professors who come, all agree that the top 100 books are normative for everyone. Because, well, it's normative for you, but it's not normative for me. So I think it would begin to break down. How do we do the justice and deconstruct without simply destroying the structure? So I'll stop there for now, but a great question.
Let me. Okay, I think Dr. Bagre wants to ask a question. Let him ask first, and then we can come to the other persons also.
Thank you, Professor, for your brilliant lecture. I wanted to know the very epistemological basis of religion has been questioned, or it has disappeared. Okay, so belief in God, transcendental world, all these beliefs have been questioned and found to be wanting. So now what remains of religion is only a political phenomenon. And religion has been a political, because every religion has the other. And this other is being oppressed, has been oppressed for millennia. And therefore, when you talk of liberation theology or emancipatory theology, so that suggests that there is nothing like religious. Everything is political or ethico-political. This is my submission.
I feel better standing when I talk. So I think you were getting at a question that I was trying to raise, is that the political critique, the economic critique, the justice critique, all of these become extremely important. But then is the idea that somehow this is a religious text, does that disappear? So every text becomes guilty. Every text becomes a human creation done for impure motives. And that the very idea that there's something sacred about it, or revealed about it, or true about it, can begin to disappear. As I said, scholars of religion often debate, is there such a thing as religion? Is there such a thing as sacred scripture? Is there such a thing as revelation? Is there such a thing as sacred truth? All of these categories can collapse unless you bring faith back into the discussion. And I think because the logic would be, as I said, the American Academy of blank, because we don't actually have any way of talking about the sacred or the true anymore. Or philosophy. Let's do philosophy, but nothing is true, so we will never get to truth questions. How do we not go off the deep end? Seems to be what you're concerned about. And it's often seen, well, that's a problem in the modern West. So the modern West is secular, the modern West is decadent. But isn't it going to be the case here? Or isn't it going to be the case in East Asia or other parts of the world? The collapse of any kind of transcendent structures or normative structures, thinkers in every culture need to be able to retrieve what the ancients were doing. So I think, as I mentioned, I think it came up briefly, my original dissertation work was in Purva Mimamsa. And the Mimamsakas, who were exceedingly hard to read and very dry thinkers, nonetheless, early on had these categories of Shruti, Smriti, Sadachara, Itihasa, and so on, Purāṇika, and so on like that. And they were trying to sort out higher truths and lower truths, and that the higher truths are more sacred, and other truths are tied in with human motivations and human purposes. they did that for their time in a very, self-flattering orthodox fashion. But if we don't have a way of distinguishing and saying the truth of what I read online today and the truth of Rig Veda or Upanishad or New Testament, they're all the same level of non-truth, we would be in, why have philosophy or religion departments at all? So I'm not answering your question really, but I'm saying we have to ask that question. Otherwise, we can do lots of philosophizing and religious studies and theologizing, and outsiders will look and say, but they don't believe any of it, so what's the point? I'm not saying we're all doing that, but there's a danger that it might look like that.
Good afternoon, everybody, and hello again, Professor. This was a wonderful lecture in continuation of yesterday's lecture. So my first question, I have two questions for you. So my first question, I would like to give you some background. That of non-Vedas, that there is no truth, there is no fixed truth. So when it comes to, let's say, common populace, which do not have that theological background. So for example, if there is a manual laborer, he comes to his home at night after doing 8 or 9 hours of manual labor. He comes back his home and he does not have this deep knowledge of religious texts, religious scriptures, and all he has, the knowledge, is passed down orally or culturally to him from the society and from the experts of that particular theology. So in past, like 200 or 300 years ago, it would have happened that a certain theologian would have propounded that, okay, this is the structure of our religion and this is how it should be. But today, in a society in which you have multicultural and multi-religious approach, and you have intercultural dialogue based on theology, how relevant is a comparative study of theology for that common person? And my second question is that, as we have seen, while we study the history of religion, we see and we notice that it is much more similar to that of a living individual, in which either it dies a natural death or it is killed by another individual or another religion, for example. So what does that say, or how does the outlook of religion as an individual look today in an era of comparative religion and theology? Thank you.
Again, I think you're getting into a deep question on the first one. I mean, you yourself said no truth, that is to say, no fixed truth. But if there's no fixing of truth claims and so on, is there really truth? And I wasn't clear. Do you believe there is no truth, or that it's impossible to fix it? Okay, but there is truth. There might be. Okay. I think, I mean, if you think about that, why comparison? So hundreds of years ago, many of the comparisons were done, as I said, to show, having done a careful study, it turns out that my tradition is the most clear, rational, plausible of all of them. So that's a reason. Or somebody else doing comparison, actually see that they're all sort of saying the same thing, or they're all equally dubious. And the point of comparison is to like flatten them all. Do we have a better way of thinking about comparison than asserting clearly that one is superior to all, or that none of them can be superior in some way? And I think this is where it seems counterintuitive. But to get back into the idea that theological comparison is stronger, because if there are people of faith, then people of faith often have convictions about what is true. But my point has been all these years, if you are a person of faith who has convictions about what is true, therefore study other people's traditions in depth. So the presentation I gave yesterday on the Alvars, it's not my tradition. I didn't grow up a Sri Vaishnava. Tamil is not my mother tongue at all, and so on. But I find as a practicing Roman Catholic, there's a great energy and desire to learn from the Alvars and the Sri Vaishnava tradition. Whereas if somebody said, well, I don't believe in the Bible, I don't believe in the Quran, I don't believe this and I don't believe that, I think I'll study Tamil literature. That you can do that, and you can be a great scholar of Tamil literature, but it's quite different from saying, I am encountering God in what I study, or reading a great philosopher. I don't believe any philosopher in the West has anything true to say. Therefore, reading a Confucian philosopher or an Indian philosopher, why would I expect them to have some truth? So in some ways, I won't get personal, but it's a personal question about why any of us do what we do and what we really care about. Is there some grounding in some kind of existential truth, at least, meaningfulness of life that we hold on to that motivates continuing thinking, continuing questioning, and I'd say, therefore, not stopping at the borders of your own tradition. So pushing the boundaries. But if nothing is true or nothing can be fixed as true, then you won't expect fixity by doing comparisons either. So your second point, was it that everything in the world either dies a natural death or gets killed? Yeah. I suppose this might get into outside my expertise in terms of biological evolution and how species change but continue to exist. Right. I mean, certainly, look at fossils and all that. So many, genuses and species of beings died out along the way, or were obliterated, or were consumed by others that came along. It could be a certain kind of, dog-eat-dog world where religions eat up each other. The powerful win out, others are obliterated, their sites are destroyed, their scriptures are burned, and the winners win by forgetting everything else. I'd like to think that history also gives examples where the conquerors failed, and that the effort to exterminate the other didn't actually work. So in any kind of aggressive tradition, we came to your country, we wanted to obliterate what you believed, we destroyed your holy places, and then annoyingly, 200-300 years later, people still believe it. There's a way in which nature has resilience and bounces back. And I would think that faith also can be resilient, or philosophical truth. You can have withering critiques, deconstructions. After Kant, let's say, knowledge, models of knowledge collapsed, or Wittgenstein makes certain philosophical questions collapse. And then people regroup and revise and bring things back in. Hopefully would be possible. But that becomes, the philosophical question. How can anything be true? And of course, philosophers have written large books about that topic. But I think, religiously speaking, this is where we can talk to the people at the gods. Religion, despite all the pressures, hasn't died out. And you can say, well, they don't know what they're doing, and it's superstition or just tourism. But lots of people have faith they're willing to die for. And they can say, well, the winner kills the other. Well, there's also the so-called losers die for their faith, and their faith doesn't die out. So again, lots of things going on. Yeah.
Can you have your questions later, because there are many other people's. You can have your follow-up later. I think Dr. Rajiv wanted to ask a question. Please come.
Thank you so much, sir, for your thought-provoking and informative talk. I found some information like that, but I want to discuss, or I want to ask about some fundamental questions like this. When you put the statement like this, that religion or the theology is the ultimate science, like, so what is not religion according to theology or the ultimate science? What is not religion? And secondly, how do we define what is ultimate science through religion? And thirdly, I hope this is the last questions. It is little descriptive in nature. If we consider that comparative religion is a method of religion, does the method resolve the religious conflict? Or does the method resolve the religious conflict, either it is intra or inter? Or it creates some religious conflict like religious conversion with, yes, and it also destroy the religious autonomy. Yes, thank you, sir.
I mean, when I was saying at the beginning, I started by talking about the medieval Christian view that the highest of the sciences is theology. I wasn't saying that that is still the case. I mean, the point was that it's not still the case, that nobody is willing usually to understand that. But people like, again, the great Catholic thinker Thomas Aquinas talked about incontrovertible first principles, that the very nature of logic or nature of language means that certain things are true. Consciousness is inescapable because even if you deny consciousness, you're consciously doing so. So certain kinds of principles that only by self-contradiction can you undercut them, as well as saying a believer accepts that the words of the scripture are beyond question. Aquinas was trying to say there are ultimate propositions and principles of reason and faith out of which the best of the sciences arises. The problem is all that, or the fact is all that broke down. And so the idea that there is an incontrovertible top science called faith or theology doesn't seem to work. But I think the long tradition of ending up with unable to say that anything is particularly true is a problem, a philosophical problem as well as a theological problem. So the science kind of dissolves, becomes a big issue. On your second question, I mean, about comparative religion in terms of intra and interreligious conversation, I mean, if I understand you, much of comparative religion is intra. So Christians doing the study of other religions to understand better the Christian faith. Like I learned so much by looking at 10 other religions. Or we're in a world of pluralism. Is it still true that my religion is the number one religion? Looking at the other religions for the sake of us. But interreligious, I guess you'd have to say, should be done by more than one person. So to do the interreligious people together, again, like people in this room, back to the earlier question about taking up a difficult topic and possibly a social topic like the mistreatment of women in tradition or a topic of violence toward other religions, and saying, I cannot solve this by critiquing your religion or defending mine or attacking mine, but we need to sit down and say, what do we do with our difficult text so that the best kind of critiquing, the best kind of comparative religion would require that we meet together and discuss across boundaries. Because in an age when the surviving believers are becoming very sectarian, and the issue is that the only way to survive is by being more loud, more pushy, gaining political power, then the pushback is to say people who are intelligent believers, we will meet together across religious boundaries like you do here and think about the hardest issues together. So intra can serve a purpose to explain to believers what's going on out there, but the inter probably is a greater need today. We can talk more, I think, but that's the start.
I think there are a lot of online participants as well. So we won't be taking so many questions from the audience here. No, I think let him go first, and then you can also have a conversation over tea. Yeah. Come.
Thank you very much for giving this opportunity to ask or raise some questions. My question is on the nature of comparative religion that you said in the arena of university setup and all other, we have chance to talk about religions. We hear about all this and we have at least some sense to understand it. I'm thinking about the tradition, who are very rigid sometimes and very fanatic. It means there is a big gap between what we do in the university setup and in the real tradition. So how do you build up this gap? Is there any way to build up this gap? So that's my first question. And the second question is that while talking about this very philosophical idea, you said, I'm spiritual and not religious. I'm spiritual man and not religious. Now, this is, are we simply neglecting the religion, or what is wrong in religion there? That we are simply telling today I am spiritual. It means that tomorrow we may define something else. If today I was not religious, I am saying I am spiritual. Tomorrow we'll define something else. While talking about this, I am remembering of Swami Vivekananda, his view. He said about religion that no need of changing religion. He said, be a good Hindu, be a good Christian, be a good Muslim. So this is the view he has given. So just in this perspective, what would be your view? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I remember many years ago, not many years ago, maybe 15 years ago, a Indian university invited me to give some lectures on the study of religion today. And they went reasonably well. People came, they came back for the second one, the third one, the fourth one. But after it was all over, I asked the professor in charge, isn't it a problem that this is being done in a philosophy department and there is no religion department at this university to do it in a religion department? So we're talking about religion topics in a philosophy department, not here, somewhere else. And he said, well, we can't have a religion department on campus because all the fanatics will come. And then we'll have fanaticism on the campus. And the point of not having a religion department is to keep the fanatics out of the campus. And I think in some ways, the practical reality I would not question. I was only a visitor. But on another level, there's a certain sense in which, yes, there is a problem of the dichotomy between having idealized conversations and listening and calmness and learning from each other. And then when swarming around outside are people who have none of that and say, off with their heads. We'll have none of that listening to the other. But I think all the more important then is to be able to say, and it's easy for me to say, that there need to be on university campuses in a department that's called philosophy and religion, serious discussion of the issues that fanatics off campus are talking about. And to be able to, hopefully in a non-inflammatory way that doesn't make things worse, raise the allergic questions, ask if people who are fanatic actually know what they're talking about, and then deal with the problems that inadvertently they may be raising. That's what universities are for, is to be able to raise these questions and deal with them in an intellectually robust environment. So I think it's a problem, but if they say, well, religion is fanatic, therefore let's not have religion on campus, is kind of self-defeating, because the fanatics don't think very well, they don't know much, and they only go by certain feelings. A university should do better. So I would say you need to have the hard conversations on campus, I would say. I mean, the issue about the spiritual but not religious, many young people who are spiritual and not religious, in fact, are they're young. And maybe some of you are young. You certainly are young, but you may be looking around about, do you believe the religion of your parents or your grandparents or not? But in America, some of the young people, meaning spiritual but not religious, there's no structure. It has to do with how I'm feeling now. Then a year from now, I feel differently. I lose my boyfriend, my girlfriend, I feel differently. Something happens in my life, I feel differently. I tried yoga, then I tried going to church, then I tried going to temple. That's the problem. Your religions are not a bad thing in the sense that they give structure, they help continuity among generations. And if somebody's entirely spiritual without religious, that leads to a fluidity that never actually continues. And religions haven't continued for thousands of years by people saying, I'm spiritual and not religious, even when people do. So, you might point to an ancient Upanishadic text about, the truth of self as opposed to ritualism, or Swami Vivekananda about, keep your religion, but know that all is one in a certain way, or versions of that in the West. All of these things work if there are religious people who care about the issues. If everybody's just sort of floating around looking for something spiritual, I don't think things get better, even though in the short run it seems if only we were all spiritual, we'd be better off. So some kind of a sense of religions too, would be better. But there's no point in just saying that to somebody, you should be religious as well as spiritual. That doesn't work. But some kind of caution about idealizing spirituality versus religion.
Yes, okay. I think, yeah, just wait. Let me take one question from online participants. Francis Philip, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hello to everybody.
Yeah, please ask your question.
Yes, actually, what Sam is discussing right now about the difference between the spirituality and religion, and about the question what will happen next with
Your
the
voice is
religion.
breaking. Hello?
Yes, is it
Can
better
you
now?
write your question in the chat box? Your voice
Right
is
now
not
it's
coming
okay.
properly. Okay, try saying it again.
Yes, right now it's okay. The voice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was talking about the what sir was discussing about the difference between the spirituality and religion, and about how sir was asking about what will happen next with religion or with atheism. My idea is recently I was also talking with the people from my country. I am from Romania, and I saw how the people make the big difference between the spirituality, philosophy, and religion. I guess all these three things are coming together because I can see even in Bhagavad Gita, even in the Puranas, how the philosophy and religion are coming together. Many things like the idea of the mind, the idea of the consciousness, many things and many questions are coming together all the time. And I guess the religion will go down in the places in which the spirituality is also go down, because I guess the philosophy and religion are always coming together. So as much as we are negating the idea of the spirituality, I guess that time the religion will also go down. Thank you so much.
So thank you for listening in by Zoom and also for your question. As far as I understand it, it wasn't entirely clear that when we talk about the spiritual and religious, some of the same issues arise that come when we talk about what is religion, what are religions, what is true or not. That the thinking spiritual, not religious, or religious and spiritual is not a private affair. Even if one says, I'm a spiritual person, often they're part of a great movement in society where spirituality of a certain sort is kind of winning over society. It's not just religions that perpetuate, but popular movements of spirituality also. And that can be seen as, again, one more sign of a problem. We never really escape as the social setting. But as you're saying, I think we also notice across religions, East and West, there are certain values, certain underlying themes about vitality, life, hope, truth, love, and so on, that come back again and again, in the sense that like death is not the end, that there's something beyond death. And it would be foolish of us to be so hypercritical about finding facile comparisons to ignore the fact that it's obvious that there's so much in common among different religions. And so somehow to recover that without saying that therefore all religions are the same or pick and choose, but nonetheless that we're not in this alone. As individuals or Hindus or Christians or Taoists, whatever, we have a lot in common. We're facing the same problems and therefore should continue learning from one another on spirituality, on religion, on philosophy, on truth. So I think that's probably not a full answer, but at least that's a starting point. So thank you for your question.
Right. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
How do you look at the contrasting view on the interreligious understanding debate, which struggle between Ekam, Sat, Vipra, Bahuda, Vadan? Truth is one, paths may be many, and its counterwise metaphor, C is one with many sources and edges. I think modern organized religions practice the latter. This present a significant challenges to theology and philosophers.
Next part of it about the Nietzschean critique was also by the same person. I mean, I remember years ago, there's a very fine professor of Hindu thought in America called Anantanand Brahmbachan. Some of you may know that name. He's a great scholar. And he takes the statement, which is over there in the world, Ekam Sat Vipraha and so on, and points out that it's the wise who call it by many names, the Vipra. Not fools call it by many names. But even if there's Ekam Sat, some kind of basic truth, wise people are not afraid to use language in different ways. And he said people often say truth is one, therefore everybody should say truth is one. But no, it's wise people who talk in different ways. And I think there's some truth to that, that the diversity of opinions overcomes the impossibility of any particular statement getting at the fullness of the truth. So it can be definitely a challenge, and I know many thinkers in the West who find this frightening. You know, if truth comes in many different forms and in many different names, that sounds like relativizing my tradition, which is absolutely 100% true. Well, they have to get over that, because in fact, there are many different ways of thinking about truth. But it's not unwise, it's not foolish to hold on to the truth of my tradition and then go out into the marketplace where all the different religions are coming together. And then the follow-up thing about Nietzsche's kind of, I suppose, annihilation of truth claims. Nietzsche is not a prophet, I mean, he is a prophet, but he's not like a revealed source that is beyond question. To study Nietzsche and to bring him into an interreligious discussion would be fun. To say, here's what Nietzsche said, enormous influence. Do we think that he was reasoning properly? Where has his faith come from? He's no greater than other thinkers just because he's a skeptic.
Okay, so just one more question, one or two. Okay, Diwakar, you go ahead, and then Avinash. I think the humid level is really discomforting us, so we won't be taking more than two questions now.
Sir, after going through the whole session, sir, the trends which we have seen in theological studies, the same trends were followed by theosophist ones. But the movement of theosophy was not so successful. So how theology would theology in comparison to theosophy? Theosophy has a large potential once it was also being considered parallel to the philosophy, but certainly after a certain period of time it get demarcates himself, the whole discipline get isolated. So don't you think the theology will also face this type of challenge, and would theology will be able to bridge the gap which theosophy would not able to? So this is my question. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm not an expert on theosophy. I've read some of Annie Besant, certainly J. Krishnamurti. I've been to the Adyar Library in New York and so on. I mean, in Madras, Chennai and all that. So I'm not an expert on theosophy entirely. Theosophy, the very word, you know, philosophy, theology, theosophy, was looking for a wisdom that would be superior to that of traditional philosophy or theology, kind of a perennial wisdom. And I think to a large extent, you're right, that it has not flourished. And there are many fine people who still adhere to theosophical principles. I wouldn't criticize them, but it hasn't been the religion of the New Age that they hoped would, you know, win out and overcome all the alternatives. So I think, given that element, and that theosophy did not actually replace philosophy and theology, then where do we go from there? I think it would be facile and not true to go back and say, see, theosophy didn't really work, therefore theology is true, because that would be self-serving. But what I like about theology, and I think one could argue for many forms of philosophy, is that the rigorous theology is not simply, I believe this, but rather, I have studied the scriptures, I've studied the traditional teachers, I've looked at contemporary teachers, I look at theory, I look at practice, and struggled out of that to create some kind of viable position. So I was just president for a year of the Catholic Theological Society of America, the world's largest theological body, Catholic theological body. And I'm very admiring, like young people, 25, 30, 35, struggling to read the Bible, read Christian tradition, and live in the 21st century. But it's a revival of theology in terms that, you know, I'm sort of used to, but a generation before me or two would say those people are not even doing theology. No, but young people are doing it in their own way. So I guess I'm optimistic that theology, with its intellectual rigor and knowing what you're talking about, just like traditional philosophy, knowing what you're talking about, has a better chance to survive than kind of a vague sense of flowing truths that are always beneath and beyond language, where then we literally don't know what we're talking about after a while. But I don't want to say that in a way that dismisses the value of theosophical efforts, but it's a big question.
Hello, Professor. Now, Professor Bagre makes a statement that every religion has a political and ethical aspect. So my question is on this ground, how can you define religious institutionalized rights? Thank you. Religious institutionalized rights, rampage. Thank you.
I mean, I think, as far as I understand, I mean, you have a very simple question, but I'm not sure I totally understood it, is that it would be irresponsible in the 21st century to deny the social, political implications of anything we say religiously. And that's part of the great kind of effort back over the centuries to uncover the motivations and political incentives that led people to speak theologically, philosophically in certain ways and exclude other views. But I think you could pick up from what I was saying, that can go so far as to say that there's only the political, only the social. But part of recovering religious thought that is not reducible to the political and social, you were asking about the rights, the RITES that go with that? Riots. Okay, I got it now. Okay, that the riot cutting religion altogether. Is that what you're asking? Yeah. I mean, so again, I think the overflow from, again, serene thinking in a university setting and looking calmly into the issues, and then saying, well, outside the walls, there's the fanatics running around causing havoc. Sometimes there are the riots that come from people who are simply angry at being oppressed by not having what rich people have, by being excluded. Some of the riots are just like, you know, anarchists against authority structures that never serve the people. And others can be, manipulated. So let's have a riot in order to terrorize the politicians. Let's intimidate them and make them stop talking by destroying their building or burning their books or something. I think, is that the kind of thing you're thinking about, that kind of rioting and damage? Because on one level, what do you do when people are being violent and chaotic and deliberately causing trouble? I mean, once I gave a lecture down in Sri Rangam, where somebody had been there who didn't dislike the topic I was talking about, but disliked something I had written a year or two before. And when it came to the Q&A, he got up and started loudly asking questions, never allowing me to answer them, but only asking more questions. until finally the convener called it quits and said, we can't do this. And I think he sort of rioted as a one-man riot to prevent the conversation from going forward. You know, you can use tear gas, you can use a stick, but those things don't really work. But how do you be a person of truth, conviction, and refuse to give in when you have a certain privilege like being at BHU, even if there are people out there who will look for clever ways to undercut what we're doing and say that if you believe in religious harmony or learning interreligiously, guess what? We're going to have a riot and destroy the bookstore. Yeah, I think we still have to try in our own way to keep doing the right thing, speaking the truth, even if there are stupid people, violent people, clueless people out there who say the way to stop it is really yelling loudly or throwing things down to the ground. We can talk more afterwards, maybe.
So,
may I ask a question? Suddenly a question crept into my mind.
yes, sir, please go
Small
ahead.
query. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for allowing me. Sir, there was a development in theology in Latin America that is called liberation theology. What is the state of affairs of that, and how you look at it, and what is the future of that liberation theology in the modern context of when we talk about just social order and ways to achieve that through theological means. Thank you.
This is not the time at this time on a humid day to explain liberation theology. Many of you are familiar with the term, but when the Roman Catholic Church began to change in the 1960s with what's called the Second Vatican Council, the meeting of bishops in Rome, and things opened up, particularly in Latin America, there were theologians who said, look, there is a great gap and discrepancy between what the gospel says and Jesus says and how the church functions as the dominant force in Latin American society. So we have a terrible gap between the rich and the poor, the hierarchical structure of the church, and the people are oppressed. There are dictators who shake hands with the bishop and have dinner together. There's something wrong here. The radical element of the gospel has been lost, or the radical element of the book of Exodus, leading the people to freedom. So figures like John Luis Segundo, Gustavo Gutierrez, and a host of others began to say theology should not simply be to comfort the wealthy or to encourage people who come to church to keep coming to church, but theology should have a radical critique edge that upsets the rich, upsets the hierarchy, and says, can't we work for a new society? It had a certain element of commonality with like Marxist critique. Society is unjust, we have to critique it. And this led to problems because some people who didn't like it, who liked the comfortable structures that existed, said, this is not liberation theology, this is Marxism with the title of Christianity on it. So we have to reject Marxism as we rejected it in Eastern Europe. And many people push back against the liberation theologians saying, you can't do this because it's not Christian. So in some ways, liberation theology is and was very exciting. It changed the attitude to no longer take for granted it's okay if certain people are rich and everybody else is poor, and if rich people hang out with the powers, the religious powers, that's not okay when the people are suffering. That has sort of permeated the mentality of so many people worldwide. It's also showed up in North America, not Latin America, in terms of liberation theology of women's rights, liberation theology of gay rights, liberation theology of racial issues. It's spread. And this Rambachan that I mentioned earlier has a book toward a Hindu liberation theology. And I think you could point to 10 other examples that the idea that theology should be prophetic and aimed at changing society has spread globally in a certain way and has a power to it, even if you look at Latin America and say, well, it didn't exactly take everything from the rich and give it to the poor. And in fact, many of the poor became Pentecostals instead of saying Catholic anyway. So in one level, it didn't work very well. On another level, it's been a global success. But the idea that theology should be prophetic and change things rather than sanctifying the status quo, I think is a wonderful insight. Thank you for that comment, and thank you for listening in online.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Prabhat wants to ask one question. Come. And next we'll go to Simi. Yeah.
I am Prabhat Ranjan Tiwari. I am doing Master of Arts in Sanskrit. It is second semester. I do offer my humble pranam to all the, especially to chief guests, Anand sir, Jha sir, Rahul sir, and my ideal teacher here, Dr. Karunan sir, and all the teachers. Sir, I have heard your lectures on the YouTube channel Harvard Divinity School with Swami Sarvapriyanandji Maharaj earlier. And I am very glad that you are here and I can ask questions, sir. Sir, the bedrock of my questions and comments is Swami Vivekananda said, I quote, religion is not in doctrine, in dogmas, nor in intellectual argumentation. It is being and becoming. It is realization, sir. And as you mentioned earlier, sir, philosophy is supreme science. Theology is higher form of all science, and queen of science is theology. And in this context, I wish to quote Madam Curie. And the quotation I quote, training your children for pure science will in due course fit them for pure religion also. Sir, I want to ask you, what is pure religion, sir? And the another question is, there is much talking, much writing about why religion needs science. But sir, there is any writing the science needs theology, religion, or philosophy? Yes, sir. It is the question, sir.
I think I would say on one level, first of all, that to contrast, true spirituality with doctrine or dogma as if they are hostile to one another is on an intellectual level simply not necessary to say. So there may be context in which people are obsessed with doctrine or obsessed with the truth of my tradition versus yours, and somebody like Swamiji needs to come along and say, no, you're being too doctrinal, you're being so dogmatic. But it would be also very dogmatic to be anti-dogmatic and to say that from now on, only what matters is the universal spirit or the Atman, Brahman pervading the universe, and we don't actually believe we can say anything true, or these 1,000 years of traditions all over the world have never really come up with a dogma that's worth keeping. I think it would be an extreme to go from, right, dogmatism is bad, anti-dogmatism has a use, but it also can be bad, but some sense of practicality. If truth means something, we have to be able to say true things. If you can never make a truth claim, even if it's open to revision, like I claim that this is true, and then you realize 10 years later, well, actually, it's not as true as I thought. If you can say, well, never can we say anything true, there's something profoundly dangerous about that, the loss of the idea of truth. And I don't mean put back in a naive sense, whatever I say or my teacher says or the philosopher said, that's true, because it's open to critique. But some sense that spirituality and doctrine are not opposed to one another, I think has to be defended as an idea. And therefore, when it comes to looking at traditions, I'm a Roman Catholic, and we have lots of doctrine in the Catholic Church. It's one of the great or terrible doctrinal traditions. And I think part of the trick is to say the thousands of years of doctrines, creeds, teachings, and so on are not merely a mistake, and that the Catholic Church has survived for thousands of years and is still a unified church globally because it actually has a creed and has certain doctrines and believes certain things about Jesus Christ and so on, and believes that certain things are not true. That no longer means, in my view, therefore, what others believe is untrue or false. But the idea that there can be, a Catholic this, or Sanatana Dharma, or some kind of Sampradayika truth passed down in a tradition, that's not a bad thing. And I think some kind of sense that faith and spirituality are not incompatible with being a rational person. And if rational people speak, they have to be able to say, once in a while I'm saying something that's true. Once in a while I'm saying something I can defend. So I think it's always one extreme or the other. One extreme is, it's true, let's not discuss it, or nothing is true because spirituality matters. And again, somebody like Swamiji can say, you people are too dogmatic, but that doesn't mean for the rest of human history, doctrine and dogma are always going to be a mistake, because that, again, would be dogmatic.
Pranam, Professor. It was obviously a wonderful paper. And very quickly, I will ask a question. I just want to know about revelation, the concept of revelation, and whether it is a subjective concept or not, and how this concept is implementing in a particular religious perspective. And my another question is, Achha. It's okay. Okay. The concept of revelation, whether it is a revelation, whether it is subjective concept or not, and if it is a concept we are accepting as a religious perspective, how it is implementing in a religious perspective. Particular religions are accepting revelation, right? And also I just want to know about the bad spirit, otherwise evil. Yeah, negative. Thank you.
So again, this would not be the point in the afternoon to start fully explaining revelation, which I'm not capable of doing anyway. But I think the understanding that I have is that revelation, and one could do this in terms of Catholic theology or Purva Mimamsa or whatever, there are certain truths that we would not know if they were not given to us authoritatively in certain teachings which have been passed down. So certain ideas in the Bible about God, or certain ritual forms talked about in the Vedas, you'd never guess that these things are right without their having been given in tradition and passed down from generation to generation. So the idea that revelation is more than you can achieve by experience or reason. Maybe the best example would be Shankaracharya. If you read his introductions to the Upanishads, he says the point of Upanishad is not simply that this is an interesting book like Chandogya Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It's an interesting book with interesting ideas in it. Or it's not the idea that the Upanishad is true if you can rationally accept what it says. But the Upanishad is telling you something you would never know otherwise, and then explaining how to get to it. So Tattvamasi, Aham Brahmasmi, sound like you could just sit down and discuss those words without any further ado. But Shankara is saying the Upanishad teaches you how to think about those words in a way that radically transforms your reality. And I think the problem with revelatory claims is if you take them out of context, they sound unconvincing. So I am Brahman, you are that reality, Jesus alone is Lord. Out of context, they sound like, well, that's a nice opinion. But if you take them in context and say, if you understand the entire gospel, you begin to understand how people are being prepared to accept that as true, or if you read the Brihadaranyaka with Shankara, you begin to understand what Aham Brahmasmi means. Then the revelation is supported by reason, supported by Shabda, but not reducible merely to reason and Shabda. So I think there's a way in which revelation crosses the boundary between, truths that kind of float down from heaven and truths that can be received and accepted by people who are willing to think and experience properly. What was the last thing you asked about? Evil spirits and so on. I mean, it's a traditional Christian view that there are evil spirits. Some have mythologized them as saying it actually has to do with psychological problems. What in ancient times people thought of as possession or being demented, held by a demon, actually in reality was psychological imbalance and so on like that. And I think we've learned a lot. I mean, by psychology, psychiatry, and so on, that many things that people attributed to demons, you don't need to attribute them to demons. In my Catholic Church, I think there's a reluctance to go so far as to say there's no such thing as the devil, and no such thing as a demon. There are evils in the world that are hard to explain simply by human evil. And there are people who do evil things that seem to be superhuman evil things. And I think you could argue this, and probably many of you have thought about it, in terms of Hindu tradition, Jain tradition, Buddhist tradition, the idea that there are not only benign spirits in the world, but powers that seem to be out to be destructive beyond the power of individuals. So I think maybe it's an open question and needs to be explained in a way that doesn't sound like I believe in ghosts, but rather to go to the extreme of saying in a rational world there's no such thing as demons, no such thing as spirits, no such thing as God, is going way too far. It's not even rational.
I think we have taken questions, quite a number, and it's been really tedious task for him to continuously speak for more than 2 hours. So I think let's not put to him some more questions. Now I would like to invite chair of this talk, Professor R.K. Jha, for his observation and comments.
Well, respected Professor Clooney, our head of the department, Professor Anand Mishra, friends, students, and the scholars, it has been really a privilege for me to sit through the entire session and have the opportunity to listen to all of you, because, of course, the presentation was brilliant. I had the opportunity to learn many things. But from the question and answer session that took place, that was also quite enlightening. So I would like to thank all of you for participating in such a vigorous manner and bringing out pertinent issues, relevant issues, to which Professor Clooney responded in a brilliant manner. Already much has been talked about, and various nuances, the diversities, complications involved in this kind of a study related with theology, especially comparative theology, comparative religion. These things have been pointed out. And I'm sure that these things are going to help our research scholars and also teachers who are dealing with these fields in a great way, because they will give them thought for further creative ideas. And that is the biggest reward that we can have out of these kinds of presentations. I'm very sure about that. And I thank Professor Clooney especially for that. Well, there are lots of things which have been talked about. I have, some ideas coming to my mind, some observations, I would say. I would just like to share them. I don't know whether my observations are acceptable, right, wrong. I don't know. I don't want to make any value judgments. I just want to share certain ideas with you people and also Professor Clooney as well. You know, the idea of religion, the idea of philosophy, these are words ultimately. And words have not just one meaning. And I'm not surprised to see that Professor Clooney is such a big fan of Wittgenstein, especially with reference to philosophical investigations. Because to be aware of the complexity which is involved with the use of any terminology, this is the essence of the later Wittgenstein. And this is at the root of most of the questions and observations which have taken place during this session. We are, of course, using the same word, maybe comparative theology, maybe religion, maybe faith. It seems we are talking of the same thing, but actually we're not talking of the same thing. If I just, go one level down and ask, okay, what do you mean by religion? I understand your question, but what is your understanding of religion? Please clarify that, then I will respond to you. Then you'll be surprised to see that almost all the people who had been posing questions or observations about religion, they would be having a different, very different kind of understanding of religion. And that would call for very different kinds of responses. And strictly that would have to be in terms that would be descriptive, not just in terms of religion. Because just harping on one word and making it, the center of all your ideas is very dangerous. Because the other person does not know what you actually mean by it. And there is no universal understanding of religion or philosophy or truth or faith that we can rely on. So we have to be very acutely aware of this shortcoming. If you lose grip of that, you're in a dangerous zone. So the first thing that we need to appreciate is that it's okay to talk about religion, okay to talk about theology, problems related with these things and these studies. But be very clear, try to be very clear about what is your understanding of any of these ideas, any of these terms, before you get into the details of these observations or critique. Because if you don't do that, you yourself do not understand what you are talking about. You are just seeing what you are asking, but you are not acutely aware of what is the, real meaning behind the term that you are using. And what would be the implications of that? You're missing out on that. So that has to be taken account. The second thing is, as far as faith. Now, I'm also going to use the word faith, but I would like to deliberate on that and describe that somewhat so that I may be able to communicate what I'm thinking when I'm talking of faith. See, faith, many a times, it is understood as if faith and rationality or intellectual thinking, they are at loggerheads. It seems either you are faithful believer or you are a rationalist, you can't be both. But what is faith, basically? Faith is, in essence, the way we use and the way we see activities related with the use of the word faith. You believe in some idea, some activity, some situation when something is communicated to you. Now, that kind of belief a person may be having may be due to various reasons. Just as Professor had pointed out, that when a Christian is believing in Jesus, he's not thinking of Jesus in a vacuum. There is a lot of theological background, cultural background, social background that has gone into his believing. And it is because of that that he is capable of believing in Jesus. Or if someone is believing in Rama or in Krishna, it's not just a name. He has encountered and experienced things related with the use of this word in various manners for you don't know how many years, maybe since his early childhood. Then he has developed an understanding of a particular term. And it is because of that understanding that he is able to repose his faith, his belief in an idea that is corresponding with that, or that he thinks is corresponding with it. So actually what happens, a person, after he has experienced various activities, various emotions, various ways of thinking related with a particular concept or a term, he in fact creates his own understanding of the connotation of that term, the idea that he actually, receives through that term. So your understanding of Krishna will not be exactly the same understanding that I may be having, even though it may be the same word. And if I say something positive or negative related with Krishna, it would be with reference to my understanding of the term. But every time it is not possible for anyone to, open up the details of your understanding of any term when you are talking. So the least that we can do is that we can be careful about jumping to conclusions when we hear someone say something. Let us all bear in mind that ultimately we are all human beings. That is something that we would generally, I think, most of the people would agree that we are all human beings. And if there is no serious physical or mental, psychological, problem associated with that person, then you would be accepting that, okay, he's capable of thinking and expressing. You would be having the normal cognitive faculties. So in that situation, we should be able to have the, we can say, we should have the capacity to grant the other person the necessary room for having his own understanding of various terms and the concepts related with them. That is one thing. Secondly, all religions, historically speaking, geographically speaking, that have been there in the world, ultimately, what are they all concerned with? They are all concerned with making human life better in some way or the other. That is their ultimate purpose. You can say that, okay, there may be political underpinnings, this, that. Yes, maybe. But if you just, put away these covert operations or covert motivations behind any such thing, then explicitly the aim is to make the human life better, to overcome the problems, the issues that the human being is facing. Just as Buddha said, what was he ultimately trying to do? He said that, no, you are facing certain problems, there are certain dukha, there are certain miseries that you are forced to face, and it is important that you find a way to overcome them. He never encouraged talk about metaphysical realities, about, other subtle realities, God, this, that. No, that would be a waste of time. And that is not going to help you immediately. What is immediately required is that you do what can eradicate your suffering. He stressed on moral values. That is something which makes you a better person, which makes you more peaceful, which makes the society a better place, which ultimately helps in reducing not only your dukh, but everyone's dukh. So there are, certain human values. There are certain human problems which everyone is facing. And everyone would come out of it, would like to come out of it. Religion is ultimately designed to deliver that. You may be having different kinds of belief systems, different texts, certainly. But this is the age of globalization. Now it is not possible for us to remain restricted to a certain geographical area and not interact with people from other areas and their ways of thinking and behaving. And when you are going to interact, either you will understand them or you will misunderstand them. And if you have a choice between understanding and misunderstanding, it's always better to understand. Because if you misunderstand, it's only going to create more problems. Therefore, understanding the culture, understanding the ways of thinking of people belonging to different places, different cultures, different religions is imperative for the world, for the society to become a better place, a place which would have less conflicts. Because if you don't do that, there is going to be more and more conflict. And it is certainly not possible, to think that if there is one reality, everyone should be thinking the same way. No, 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 it is not possible. I put a glass of water before you, half glass of water. One person having a different cultural background, another culture coming from a different cultural linguistic background, of course they will be using different terminologies. Someone would be saying it is half full, someone would be saying it is half empty. Someone would be saying that this is a glass only, he would not be noticing the water at all. Someone would be saying it is water. So there would be thousands of ways in which it can be communicated. So what should we think? Is there no truth? Is there nothing that is common to the experience of all of them? Jumping to such conclusions in the light of this very common experience would be wrong. Just as the Jainas say, elephant, different people describing it in different ways, does not mean that the elephant was different for all of them. They were focusing on different things. So the relativity of knowledge, the relativity of truth, I mean, this is something that we, the students of philosophy, know very well in the post-modernist age. There is no grand truth at the empirical level. There is no truth that will be universally and absolutely the same for everyone. We use the word truth, we use the word reality, but ultimately it is from my perspective. And what factors go into making my perspective, it's very difficult to enumerate all those factors because there would be so many factors. It's absolutely unimaginable to enumerate. So at least the least that we can do is that we can appreciate the complexity of the mechanism through which we develop our understanding of any term, any concept. And of course, we use language. There is no other way in which we can communicate. For the ordinary human beings, language is the means through which we communicate. But what Wittgenstein had said about language, it's a matter of convention. It's a matter of language game. We agree to behave and respond in a certain manner to certain linguistic expressions and commands, and that is how we agree that it is this way. But that is no guarantee to saying that what you have in your mind when you use that word will be the same that I have in my mind when I use the word. There is no guarantee about that. So there are lots of things which need to be appreciated before you jump out to criticize anyone, before you jump out to make a value judgment about any view. No. Coming in academics, trying to develop higher studies, one very common theme is that you should be having the patience, you should be liberal, you should have the capacity to appreciate the other, to tolerate differences, and much better than tolerating, understanding the diversity and appreciating the diversity. Tolerance is not a good situation. I don't like you, I tolerate you. No, that's not good. I should like you, despite your difference from me. Why should everything be the same kind? Why should every person think in the same way? That would be boring. If all of us become exactly the same, even in a family, leave alone the world and the society, it would be so boring. So diversity is God's gift to the world, and we should appreciate it. We should not run away from it and be frightened by it. Okay? So these are, just some scattered ideas that I was having in my mind. And I don't know what I talked, but if I made any sense, thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your really keen remarks. Before we really proceed to the close of the session, there's just one announcement that I would like to make. Professor Clooney is going to speak tomorrow at Maitri Bhavan in Bhelupur, and he will be speaking on learning interreligiously from each other. And this talk will be at 4 p.m. tomorrow. So all those who are interested, you are all requested to join him tomorrow as well. Now I would like to invite Dr. Kalpana Yadavji to please come and give vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Rahul, for giving me this opportunity on the behalf of the department. I'm Dr. Kalpana Yadav, Assistant Professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion, Banaras Hindu University. This is first lecture of Chookolingo lecture series. So first of all, I would like to express my deep thanks to speaker of this lecture series, Sir Professor Francis Clooney, who presented lucid and informative interpretations regarding current developments in comparative religions and theological studies. Thank you so much, sir, for this luminous presentation. Next, I would like to express my deep thanks to President of this lecture series, Sir Professor R.K. Jha. I express my deep thanks to Sir, Professor R.K. Jha, sir. And next, I would like to thank Head of the Department, Professor Anand Mishra. And we know very well that this commendable work is being done under his supervision. So thank you so much for this contribution, for this guidance. Thank you so much, sir. Next, I would like to thank all the faculty members from our department and other universities. I would like to name some of professors here, such as Dr. P.K. Bagre sir, Priyanka Mishra ji, Durgesh sir, and Alok Tandon sir. Thank you so much to all of you. And at last, students, my dear students and research scholars, you all are the most important part of any lecture series, any seminar. So I express my deep thanks to all of you for active participation. Thank you so much. Next, I express my deep thanks to convener of this lecture series, Dr. Rahul. Thank you, Rahul. And I congratulate to you. And at last, I would like to end here. Over to you, Rahul. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today.
Okay, so now we have come to a close. Thank you, Dr. Kalpana, for giving vote of thanks. Now you are all requested to join us for tea. Yeah, thank you.